Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the part 3 of module 1. We call this part language, meaning and reality. Before we move ahead, let us have a quick recap on the two parts that we have already completed, two different trajectories in history that we have already looked at. Part 1 basically traced the history of the studies on the nature of human thought as it has taken place over centuries. Here we looked at how the working of the human brain, human mind has always intrigued scholars across centuries, across space and time, and how it all started, what are the different trajectories it took, what are the different standpoints in different times of history and so on. So, starting with the ancients till the modern time, we have charted the history in terms of important landmarks and important scholars that have been that have given us various new insights into this discipline, which helps us understand as the field is today. Part 2 looked at the relationship between brain and cognition and the developmental trajectories that have taken that the field has seen in these two different domains of research. Now, it is not probably entirely correct to say that these two disciplines have been separate. From the very beginning, the idea of mind, the idea of thought and the idea of brain and language have been intertwined with each other in different degrees, depending on the time, depending on the particular scholar we are talking about, particular given philosophical thought at that point, but they have remained connected through history, and this is what we have seen till now. We have also looked at the role of language in all of these, how language was seen starting from the ancient time till the cognitive revolution and up to the modern time. As to what role does language play, is it an important tool or is it just a mirror that helps us reflect the events, the facts, the truth of the world into the human mind and so on. We have also talked about some of the debates, some of the controversies surrounding these ideas and how there have been primarily two different camps in terms of the nature of thought and in terms of how language fits into this, whether language is entirely symbolic or it is embodied understanding of language, which is quite well taken these days, also traces its roots to the ancient times. The ideas, the debates have always been there. So, after looking at these issues from philosophical and neuroscientific points of view, of course, in very brief, now let us move on to looking at this from a linguistics point of view, because this course is primarily a language course, linguistics course that looks at language from the perspective of cognition. So, a historical overview about how the field of linguistics itself has developed and what have been the primary preoccupations of linguists over time, and what are the main theoretical standpoints and how things have how theories and their uses have changed over time and what are the main debates. This is what we will look into in this section. So, this is a roadmap, language from linguistics point of view, and where we will discuss some very important milestones in linguistics. Because this is only a part in the introductory module, we will not get into all the it will not be possible to get into all the major events that have happened, but we will try and cover as much as possible and as much as is relevant for this course, to give you an idea about the background in which we place this entire course. And then we will move on to how meaning has been dealt with in the field, in the field of linguistics, and then move on to meaning and reality and the relationship of language. So, to start with language from the linguistics perspective, that is, there are some sobering thoughts. Initially, it was thought that only humans are capable of language, only humans speak, so to say. However, there are some very sobering discoveries of late. There have been studies, ongoing studies on animal, in the animal kingdom, their communication system, various kinds of signals that various animals are putting into use for various purposes. We are yet to know the entire scenario, we are yet to know the entire truth in this domain yet, but what we do know is that certain animals, certain members of the species, various species like bees, whales, zebra finch and so on, have very complex signal system among themselves, to be used within the community for various purposes, and the complexity of which we are only beginning to understand. For example, zebra finch have been found to actually literally learn to sing. In the initial stages, the baby zebra finch just babbles like human babies, and it is unstructured apparently, and over a period of time, noticing the adult zebra finch, they learn how to sing as far as the pattern in the community goes. So, there are all these interesting findings. Recently, quite recently in fact, a very similar discovery was made about prairie dogs as well. Now, prairie dogs are a very intelligent species apparently in terms of language use. They use a variety of squeaks, seeps, chatters, chitters and so on, various kinds of different calls, and research shows that these calls are not just some sounds, that arbitrary sounds that they are making. In fact, there is a structure to it, there is a purpose to it, and there is an usage, almost like a speech act quality to it. So, depending on the need of the hour, they will be using different kinds of chitters. For example, to warn of approaching predators that caused, they will use one kind of chitter, and which will eventually, as a result of which, there will be defensive and evasive actions in the colony. So, one or two or few members will warn the rest of the community to take a defensive position or to hide, or various actions that are necessary at that given point of time. In fact, acoustic analysis shows that individual differences do not actually exist. What the differences that actually come out is dependent on the kind of stimulus that they have. So, different kinds of stimulus would elicit different kinds of calls, which means it is very structured. It has its own structure, which is understood by all members of the community. Faced with humans, when humans approach their colonies, they have a distinct set of calls which are different from other kinds of calls. So, that is as refined as it goes. Of course, there are finer details into this. If one is interested, I will add the reference at the end. It is a very fascinating study. So, this kind of findings, different findings with respect to the different signal systems, however complex they are, ultimately have led researchers to make a judgment on the basis of their use. The kind of there is an amount of agreement that even when these animals are capable of using signals for various kinds of purposes, it is still dependent on the current scenario, dependent on the events that are unfolding in real time, here and now. So, they can, dependent on the kind of predators they see, they can warn their members, group members to run away or to to be defensive and so on and so forth. So, this is entirely dependent on the immediate environment. Whatever is happening in the immediate environment, they can in some sense talk about it. As a result of which, many believe, many presume that animals suffer from some kind of an imprisonment, cognitive imprisonment, so to say, in the present. So, they are capable of course, communicating about various threat perceptions and so on. However, that is restricted to the current environment, immediate present. Well, that is as far as our current knowledge goes. We really do not know. It is quite possible that after more research we will get to know, we will be in a better position to talk about this, but at present this is the presumption. So, there is a difference between human language and the language like communication system in various animal species that we find. So, humans on the other hand, what is the main difference? Humans on the other hand have used language to set us free from this imprisonment. Language actually helps humans to talk about the present, the past, the future, to make judgments, to deliberate on actions, to talk about the universe, as we have already seen. We have already seen that language used by humans has made us capable of talking about the cosmos to the atom and beyond. So, to start with, we believe that language can be a thought, a vehicle of thought itself, and one can talk about past, present, future and so on and so forth. Another interesting aspect of human language is of course the intentionality as a part of language, and we use language to talk about the world outside of us. It also creates a social world for humans. Of course, we can argue that animals capable of using signals also create a social world, but probably it is as of now that is, we still believe that our social world, creation of the social world is far more complex and multi-layered as opposed to other animal species. So, we create knowledge of the world like science and mathematics as well as abstract domains transmissible. So, we can use language to talk about mathematics, we can talk about use language to talk about art, culture, history, architecture and so on and so forth. We can use language to transmit that knowledge from one person to another, one community to another, from one time to another, and basically across time and space and people. So, that sets us apart from other species as to what are the purposes of language, how do we use language, and what is one unique feature of human language. So far whatever we have seen in terms of philosophy and neuroscience of language and various schools of thought, we can safely say that there are primarily two ways of looking at language. If we ask what is language, there are subtle nuances here and there, but largely we can say that on the one side we look at language as a structured set of forms and manipulation of abstract symbols. So, there are symbols which are arbitrary of course, and then those symbols are manipulated in terms of certain rules, and that is what makes language somewhat like a computer function, somewhat, because it is ultimately a symbol manipulation system. That is one part of the story. On the other hand, there is an equally dominant school of thought that says language is predominantly a process which is devoted to conceptualization and communication of meaning, because ultimately language helps us communicate, and communication is heavily dependent upon the meaning. There is no point talking if you do not mean anything by your sentences. So, and how do we arrive at that meaning? That is a process in itself. The process of conceptualization and transmission of that conceptualization is what language is all about. So, these are roughly the two ways of looking at it, or maybe we can say, as we will see towards the end, maybe these are two sides of the same story. In the previous parts, as we have already discussed, we have already looked at the historical aspects of language related studies from different perspectives, not in terms of linguistics as a discipline. In modern times, around the time of cognitive revolution, the nature of language of course underwent a lot of debate, as we have seen that symbolic cognition on the one hand thinks language is purely a symbol manipulating system, whereas on the other hand the embodied cognition approach takes a different stand on this matter. So, now let us look at the story from a historical perspective of linguistics as a discipline. We will start with Ferdinand de Saussure, not because he was the first to study languages, but in many ways he is considered the first linguist of the modern era. Of course, we can go back in time and talk about Panini in India and other scholars in the in other places, but let us start with the modern era in order to understand how in the modern time how linguistics as a discipline have flourished. So, Ferdinand de Saussure worked in the late 19th century, early 20th century. He is credited with bringing in new changes, into the study of language itself. Before Ferdinand de Saussure, it is important to remember that this was a time after the colonial period, colonial period was still going on. So, during the colonial period, there were new languages, new worlds as they are called were found, new languages, new communities came to light. Western European voyagers, they went and found new countries, new languages, new people. That naturally gave rise to a lot of debates as to how these languages are different from the languages that they spoke, for example, English, Spanish or Dutch or Portuguese and so on, the dominant languages of the world of that time, dominant colonial powers of the time. So, there was a lot of activity in terms of trying to understand language in terms of culture, and more often than not it took a slightly there was a hierarchy that was put in place, that certain languages that they did not understand were somehow not at par with the European languages and so on. But overall language anthropological linguistics basically started from these endeavors. And slightly before that, as you all probably know, that William Jones' work on Sanskrit and how this actually unleashed a lot of work in historical linguistics, trying to find out the how languages changed over time, how creating the proto language, formulating the proto languages, how the language families came into being. A lot of work, very important work took place around that time. So, 18th and 19th century was primarily devoted to understanding the history of languages, how languages, different kinds of languages came into being, what are the historical connection between them, how the changes took place, how the sounds changed over a period of time as well as space and so on. So, these were the focus of language studies at that time before Saussure. They were studying language not to understand language itself as at a given point of time, but they are looking at the historical processes that has been at work since time immemorial as to what language came out of what, which are the sister languages, which is the mother language and so on. In that light, Saussure becomes very important figure for us, because he was the person who said that we can study language for its own sake. We do not really, even if we do not look at the history of it, even if we do not look at the sound change across languages and so on, even then it does make sense. So, that is what basically he did. He ushered in the idea of studying language for itself, not to understand history, not to understand anything else beyond language, but just to understand language itself, how the structure works, what are the finer nuances within a language and so on. His major contributions are of course these two, though he was a scholar, a very important scholar, and it is not possible to limit him only to couple of things, but for the brevity of space we will have to do that. So, we will stick to his two major contributions, which is the difference between synchronic and diachronic linguistics and his contribution in terms of langue and parole. So, synchronic versus diachronic linguistics was a very significant aspect of his contribution, as we have just mentioned that the comparative philologist before him contributed towards understanding and knowledge about the historical development of languages, right. So, they were looking at if Sanskrit is the mother language, what are the daughter languages, what are the sister languages, and how languages spread across continents, and what are the differences, what are the similarities, and how sound changed and so on. This was the background. Saussure brought in the assertion that the studying contemporary languages was equally important. It is not only important to understand the history, but looking at languages as it is right now is also important. That is how he proposed this two-way difference. Saussure was very fond of giving analogy of chess to make his argument in terms of language. So, he does this with this as well, with this case of synchronic versus diachronic linguistics. Now, diachronic, let us make the let us define what it is. Diachronic linguistics basically refers to understanding language, studying language across time. So, the historical aspects of it, how languages came into the current shape, how it came to the current structure, how it got the current sound system and so on. So, across time, studying language across time is diachronic linguistics. Synchronic on the other hand, studying the language as structure as it is at a particular given point of time, time remains fixed. So, you look at language right now. So, he gives an example, he gives an analogy through the game of chess in this case. He says just in the game of chess, the arrangement of the board is constantly changing. We are all, if it is a game in progress, the arrangement of the pieces, chess pieces on the board constantly changes because of the movements of those pieces across the board. Similarly, language also changes all the time. Language is a living thing, so it depends on humans, so language is also changing. At any given point of time, if you look at it, it is in a process of change. However, at any given point also, the arrangement is itself meaningful. If you look at a chessboard while the game is on and you look at the arrangement of the pieces on the chessboard, it does tell you something. It tells you where exactly the what is the arrangement, who is winning, or what stage of the game one is, and so on. So, just as at any given point of time, the pieces on a chessboard are meaningful by themselves, even if they have come to that situation, they have come to that particular arrangement over a period of time during the game, it is still meaningful even if you do not look at the history of it. So, even if one does not know how this arrangement came into place, even then the arrangement itself makes sense. So, that is how language also has a similar, can be understood in a similar way. Even if we do not know how English came to be structured the way it is now, it is still important to look at the structure as it is now without looking at the history of it. In terms of meaning, we are talking about meaning because that is what we will be ultimately following up. So, Saussure uses the same analogy to talk about meaning as well. How is meaning important, and how do we understand that? So, he says any piece of chess can be called a bishop. Any piece of chess, we just decided, it is just a matter of conventional agreement that this particular piece comes to be called as a bishop. As we have seen before also, this is arbitrary. The relationship between a signifier and a signified, that is the name and the object, the referent and the name, the relationship between these two is arbitrary. That is what Saussure basically means, that there is no reason as to why the bishop in the chess should be called a bishop. There is no bishopness about the piece itself. So, this is the matter of convention. Similarly, any sound can represent the idea of a tree, or for that matter anything, a computer or a screen like this behind me and so on. So, this particular relationship is arbitrary. So, he said that signifier and signified share a relationship that is arbitrary. Now, how do we come to the meaning of what is the status of meaning of each word in a given sentence or in any particular formation? So, he said that words are meaningful in terms of their relationship with other words. Again, he comes to the analogy of chess and he says that just as the move of one chess piece has meaning for other chess pieces, similarly language, a word gets meaning from its association with other words in the same system to a large extent. So, thus words do not function in a vacuum, they do not make sense in a vacuum, it has to be understood in the context of its usage with other words. So, basically language is an organized system. Language is an organized system with signifier and signified into it, which has an arbitrary relationship, but the signifiers themselves are related to each other. This is the gist of the matter. Then we move on to his idea of langue and parole. This is also a very important contribution because he gives a name to it, but these ideas have been there and it has been also taken up later and debated very significantly. So, he uses the words lang and parole to refer to two different aspects of language itself. So, lang refers to the rules of the total system of language, something that we have been calling the abstract representation in the brain of language, the entire system of language. What we mean by what we mean when we say that we know a language, that is the system of language. We know, if I say I know English language, it means that I know the rules that govern this language. I know how to use how to create grammatical sentences, and I also know when somebody speaks an ungrammatical sentence that this is wrong, and this is wrong because this is the violation of these rules, and so on. So, the entire system, the rules, entire system of rules of a language that is there in our understanding, in our mind, is what he refers to as lang. On the other hand, parole refers to the actual use of the language, which is the speech. So, when we speak, the output that is there in that which is dependent on many factors is what he calls parole. After giving this binary opposition of lang and parole, or the two sides of how language is, he also mentions that it is lang which is the primary concern of linguists, because linguists must be bothered about, concerned with the rules that govern the language, something that is unchangeable, something that is there for all language speakers to know. It is parole is not an should not be the idea that we should be studying. It cannot be primary, parole cannot be primary, that is what he makes. An example that can make this point clearer is that even if a parrot can speak the words of a language, we often see that many birds do mimic a human language. So, you can teach, so to say, a parrot to speak, but even if a parrot does utter the words of a language, it cannot be really said to have the knowledge of the language. Even if I teach a pet parrot to speak in Hindi or in English, or for that matter any other language, we cannot really say that the parrot knows that language. On the other hand, if somebody knows the language, if somebody has idea about the system of the language, he or she may choose not to speak. So, even if you have you can have a lang, but no parole, but if you have a parole, you cannot be said to have a lang, that is the idea. So, you might have the knowledge of the language, but you do not speak. So, there is no output, that is no parole, but you still have the knowledge. But just having parole does not mean much. That is why he said that lang is the one that should be studied in detail, and that is what will ultimately give us insight into the structure of languages. So, in viewing language as a system in itself, he was the first person to really come up with this as a system, he was on his way to establish language studies, linguistics as a discipline in itself, as an important domain to investigate. So, in viewing language as a system in itself, that too a cognitive system, because he said that this is internal, the lang is internal, it is there in the brain, and we already have this knowledge. If you know a language, you have the lang inside of your mind. So, he basically places language as a cognitive system within one's mind, that is there within one's mind. So, as in that way, Saussure is always often understood as a precursor to modern linguistic theories. This is something that we already know, but in his time this was a major standpoint to take, because language was considered not so much of a mental state, so much of the cognitivism was still not fashionable. So, that is why Saussure is understood to be a precursor to today's mentalistic approach to language studies. The next scholar, a towering figure that we will talk about, without whom any study of linguistics will not be complete, is Leonard Bloomfield. Bloomfield was also a structuralist, and he brought structuralism to America. He is an American linguist, and he is credited with the development of formal methods and procedures to study languages. So, he believed that language structure should be studied, of course, and they should be studied in a proper way, because of and to do that he devised methods, notational systems. He devised for studies of language how to really create formal methods. That is where his major contribution lies, and procedures. So, analyzing language needs some kind of a structured approach, it needs some kind of a scientific method. This is what Bloomfield brought into it. He studied a lot of languages, many of them were considered exotic languages at that time, and remember the colonial hangover. So, these were understood to be exotic from their perspective, from the Western perspective. So, Tagalog in Philippines and Malayo-Polynesian and many other languages that he studied, and he used his methods, his scientific method to analyze and describe these languages using these methods, and he became a very important figure, probably the most looming figure in linguistics in America in his time. He was a behaviorist. He came under the influence of A.P. Weiss in Ohio, and he gradually became a total behaviorist towards in the later days. So, as a result of which he completely rejected the psychological features of language. So, he did not consider it a mental state, so to say, and he considered it entirely a physical phenomenon, something that we have, something that we see. So, the tangible evidence, the tangible system that we see, and those outputs that can be studied, explained through rules, and thus yield some amount of prediction, only those aspects need to be studied as far as Bloomfield is concerned. So, meaning was not really given much importance to in Bloomfield's study, though he is credited with refining the structure of analysis, refining the methods of analysis of languages in terms of structure. However, meaning was not his favorite topic. Now, we come to another very important strand in this entire puzzle is Franz Boas. Franz Boas worked on various Native American languages of that time, and that brought, as I previously mentioned, that in the exposure to various languages that the Western world did not previously know, gave a rise to a lot of that opened the floodgate literally of studying the exotic languages. So, Franz Boas was also among them. However, he took a completely different turn. He established a tradition within the study of language in America that concentrated on the links between language and culture. However, unlike his predecessors, he did not link this relationship between language and culture from hierarchical perspectives. The others before him did give a lot of importance to this hierarchy, where Western languages were considered to be at the pinnacle of civilization and finery and so on. He had a strong departure from that standpoint, and in his study of Native American languages, he argued very strongly against close relationship between race and language, a standpoint that was quite favorable at that time. He said that this language, one particular language probably has this kind of structures which are different from the languages that we speak, does not mean that this language is deficient in some sense. That was primarily the standpoint. So, languages, in his descriptive studies of various Native American languages, he primarily tried to show that these languages have this kind of structures, and this is related to this particular community. That is all, there is no value judgment there. So, different languages have different structures, different ways of expressing the same thing, and this is just a matter of differences, not a matter of quality in some sense. This is just a difference, plain and simple. Edward Sapir, his student, carried this idea on, and later on Sapir is the one half of the Sapir-Whorf duo. So, in his work, language culture interrelationship grew a lot further after he was influenced by Franz Boas, and linguistic differences and cultural differences he looked at from a very different standpoint. Just like Boas, he also carried this forward, that linguistic and cultural differences probably have something that can tell us about the world, how different points of view are there, different points of view as enshrined in language structure. So, because some languages have different ways of expressing the same thing, like the sense of time and space and relationships and so on, that the world view basically, that probably tells us something about the relativity aspect. So, that is where we will move. That is what Edward Said and Benjamin Lee Whorf are credited with, the relativism, the idea of relativity, linguistic relativity. So, languages are important to understand how different people are, how different world views are there in different cultural systems. So, his major contribution again was in terms of the studies on the indigenous languages of the Americas. So, he studied a lot of them, and he also of course, he did many other things apart from his language culture relationship studies. He also developed the concept of phoneme, and he was also a torch bearer of Yiddish language studies in the US. He was he spoke Yiddish as his first language, and he did a lot of important works on that, given a structural description and so on. However, since we are talking about meaning here, he did not ignore meaning in the language. In fact, that is where his whole contribution, a lot of his contribution actually lies. He mentioned in his book that human thinking is structured by the language one uses. It is a very strong claim to make. He showed that because he showed through his study on different indigenous languages that they are structured differently. In fact, as a result of which he says, in fact, they look at the world also differently. So, the gradual next step that he took was to say that the language that you speak basically colors the way you look at the world. So, this is and I quote, language habits of our community predispose certain choices of interpretation. So, the language that you speak makes you look at the world in a particular way. This was the claim that he made in his book Language and Introduction to the Study of Speech, 1921. Now, we will move on to Benjamin Lee Whorf. His student Benjamin Lee Whorf was basically a fire safety engineer by profession, but he also studied Native American languages to a great extent, and he developed Sapir's ideas further and opined that along with language, our basic notions may also be influenced by, along with language, our basic notions can also be influenced by language. Language shapes conceptualization. He says that language may actually create conceptualization. It may not just color, but it creates our conceptualization. This particular stand of that has been espoused by both Sapir and Whorf, and as a result of which it is called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the other name for it is linguistic relativity. So, what is linguistic relativity? It is entirely based on the meaning aspect of language. So, the way a language is structured, the way it conveys the meaning about a particular aspect of the world basically structures the way we look at the world as well. So, if your language has many different ways of looking at a particular object, probably it looks at it makes you more adept at understanding that concept at a finer aspect, if as opposed to a language that does not have so many different ways of looking at it, structurally speaking. So, they had a very strong claim to make, and linguistic relativity was quite popular for some time, and it actually made very important claims. So, he studied again many Native American languages. Hopi is the famous case. In fact, the case of time in Hopi is a famous one. So, notions of space, time, matter can differ. He says something as basic. So, it is not only on the surface that you talk differently about certain things, but even your primary notions about basic human cognition, basic human understanding about things like space, time and so on might also change depending on the language that you speak. Hopi was a language that was given as an example, and the concept of time in Hopi, due to brevity of time we cannot really go into the details of the language, but based on that languages studies, he made this very strong claim. Another important contribution of Whorf is on the in the case of habitual use. So, if you use a language, if you use certain structure in a language, it colors, it changes you the way habitually you look at a particular thing that it denotes. The very famous example of this was that understanding of full versus empty gasoline drums. So, as you know, Whorf was a fire safety engineer. He worked for an insurance company. So, during one of his visits to a particular facility, one particular storehouse or somewhere, so he went there and he saw that the full drums of gasoline were placed in one room, the other room had empty gasoline drums. Now, the empty gasoline drums actually have the gasoline vapor in that, which makes them far more flammable as opposed to the full drums. However, he saw a lot of workers sitting in that room and smoking. And when he asked how can they smoke in the room with the gasoline drums, they said it is empty. Now, he knows as an engineer that this is very this can be extremely dangerous. In fact, the empty gasoline drums are far more dangerous than the full gasoline drums, but because it is called empty, the workers, normally the people who are using that language do not take them as seriously. So, they are not taken as a threat at all. So, this is an example he gave to show that how the use of language, the structure of language also colors our habitual thought process. So, in many ways they actually were the pioneers to study language, culture and cognition. This is a statement he makes, and I quote, "We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages." Thus, the work of Sapir and Whorf contributed to the understanding of the relationship between language, culture and cognition to a large extent. However, all these were descriptive studies, these were speculative and descriptive to a large extent, and there was hardly any experimental work that backed up their claims. By 1960s, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, however, was very harshly critiqued and it went out of fashion. If you remember, we talked about the cognitive revolution that was taking place in the ground was already prepared in the 40s, and 40s, 50s and 60s saw a lot of activities and a lot of new new disciplines came into being, a lot of new work was going on, lot of new findings, empirical data available. All that made Sapir-Whorf hypothesis go completely out of fashion, and cognitive universalism was more important, was the flavor of the season, so to say. So, it completely disagreed with the question of relativity. Cognitive universalism basically talks about the centrality, the universality of the central mental mechanism of the human mind. So, you cannot really as a result of which it did not find much support for relativity hypothesis. So, in the late 20th century, however, there was a resurgence of interest in their work and it is called neo-Whorfism. A lot of new interest has been generated, and with the help of empirical research, with the help of latest technology, some researchers are looking at those questions yet again. But we will discuss this during the course. Of course, many of these will be discussed. Then during 1950s, 60s, cognitive revolution took place. Behaviorism came under attack, as we have discussed before. Behaviorism for language basically refers to the aspect that language is learned behavior. It is out there in the society. It is there in it is a stimulus response kind of a system. So, that was also attacked in terms of language studies. It was most famous attack on it came from Chomsky, Noam Chomsky. And then of course, the advances in allied fields, all these relate to the serious challenges to structuralism in linguistic studies. So much so that even well known structuralists like Charles Hockett and Zelig Harris also started bringing changes to the way they looked at language studies. So, Hockett agreed that it is not possible to have an entirely objective analysis and description of language, because descriptivists, the structuralists were looking at language objectively, only the structure as it is. But Hockett towards later period of time agreed that probably some amount of empathy, he called it empathy, by the researcher was always put in the analysis of the structure. So, it is not probably entirely objective. So, descriptive studies structuralism was getting questioned from the practitioners of the field themselves. Similarly, Zelig Harris also started bringing in transformation rules while describing the syntactic system in a language. So, though he was working still within the descriptive framework, he tried to bring in transformation rules to organize the data in a better way. But he does not, of course, try to create one single abstract rule that applies to all languages, which of course his student takes it forward. So, that is where we come to Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is probably the most well known linguist of all times, not only in terms of the powerful claims he makes, but also in terms of the contribution he has had to myriad disciplines, not only linguistics, but his contribution was felt among various disciplines of the time. So, His primary contribution of Chomsky was, as I said, he attacked behaviorism very strongly, giving very strong arguments against it, and we can actually talk about his contribution only in terms of 2-3 things here. So, mentalism, he says that language is something that is not out there, it is not in the environment that you teach somebody. Students do not need to be taught language, so to say. Children do not need to be taught language. Language is something that we are born with. It is hardwired into our brain. So, it is something that is innate. So, innateness hypothesis is Chomsky's biggest contribution to the study of languages. He says that every human being, by virtue of being a human, is born with a system which initially called LAD, language acquisition device, which he later called universal grammar. So, there is an abstract, there is a system of abstract rules that applies to languages, which is something that everybody or all humans are born with. So, this is innate capacity in us, and this is something that you cannot probably teach. This idea he carried forward with the help of a very strong argument of poverty of stimulus. He says that every human is capable of generating an unfathomable number of sentences during his lifetime, sentences and structure that he has never ever heard. So, if language was a stimulus response system, then stimulus and response should be similar, they should be equal, at least equivalent. But this is not the case. You cannot have learned all the sentences that you generate in your lifetime. So, that poverty in terms of stimulus is something that proves that we are capable of creating sentences based on the rules. Because we have those rules in our head, we are able to create those sentences using the same rules. We can create multiple permutations and computations on those same set of inputs that we have, the words that we have, and so on. So, innateness on the one hand is his primary contribution, and on the other hand he focuses his studies mostly on syntax. So, his idea, like we have seen how language was understood as a logical, if you look at language as logical language, then it also has serious repercussions for the idea of logic, for the idea of mathematics, and so on. Similarly, Chomsky also takes the similar kind of stand, and he says that syntax is most important thing to study, how the sentence structures are created, how they are transformed, what are the rules that govern them, so on and so forth. He does not give much importance to meaning. Of course, Chomsky is one figure who has made revisions to his own theory over a period of time, so many revisions, and he has taken to a later time he has included semantics to some extent. But by and large he looks at syntax as the central aspect of language, meaning is not so very important. The most important sentence that he has among many he has given out to make this point is that colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which all of you are of course aware of. So, even if a sentence as meaningless as this can still be understood, so to say, by the native speakers of English as having some kind of a meaning. So, that is where he really makes a point that it is because it is structured properly, because it is not violating any of the syntactic rules of the language, it is a perfect language. So, grammaticality, the syntactic grammaticality in terms of syntactic formations is what is paramount, meaning is not so important. So, as a result of which we see that science during the emergence of cognitive science as a discipline, Chomsky was working on language. So, he was trying to position language studies firmly as a scientific endeavor. So, Saussure and Bloomfield and others are credited with making linguistics as a serious subject to look at, serious endeavor to pursue. If language, they brought language to the center point, to the focal point of studies on its own right, on its own ground. Chomsky, on the other hand, is credited with aligning the same with science as in the hard sciences like physics, like mathematics, and so on. In fact, often he aligns linguistics with mathematics, though of course he has faced a lot of criticism because of this from various standpoints. However, his contribution cannot ever be denied. So, one of the central points of attack on critique on Chomskyan paradigm is that it concerns itself more with theory than with understanding language. So, now till now we have seen that language has been seen from various standpoints. Before Chomsky, it was the language as it is, like the structure of language. With Chomsky, we go into the theory of how it actually is. So, the mental aspect of it, the way it is inbuilt into our system. So, basically while trying to theorize about language, about some rules that govern it, we are going away from the understanding aspect of language. So, basically from the nature of language to the theory of language compromises certain aspects which are inherent to something as human as language. That is the first critique of, that is in fact the most important criticism that Chomsky faced. So, in order to establish linguistics as a science, efforts were made to make it a system that is independent of context and users, because the abstract aspect, remember Lang, that is the abstract set of rules that human languages have, that knowledge of which every human has, is that it should be understood in terms of its features, in terms of the rules, in terms of the permutations and combinations, the way it really functions, and as a result of which it should not be dependent on contexts and users, because the moment you bring it down to context and users, there are compromises to be had. So, it is like physics or mathematics, for example, those rules of physics do not change if it is applied to a different context. Similarly, language. So, that was the ambition of Chomskyan paradigm, to make it a total science, and as a result of which context and users were completely ignored to a large extent. This was one very simple major critique. Second was the syntax centric framework. Entire focus was on syntactic formations, syntactic rules and so on, as a result of which meaning was compromised. And there is a lot of criticism that Chomsky faced because of this, because without meaning language has very limited use. If you do not have meaning incorporated, then there is no point in talking. Another thing, another important aspect on which the criticism came in is modularity. This actually draws from the scientific aspect of language, where he takes language as a field in itself, and which should be devoid of contexts and devoid of any other functions. So, language is independent of all other mental faculties, a very serious claim to make, but Chomskyan paradigm does make that claim, that it is complete in itself, it does not depend on other mental faculties, as it does not depend on context and users. So, language, however, the developments after 1950s from various disciplines like neuroscience, like psychology and many other disciplines, that show that language use actually involves processing of many aspects of knowledge, experience, beliefs and so on, and without which language will not be a viable option for communication at all. It cannot be a mathematical symbol, it cannot be a mathematical formula that we use all the time. It has it imbibes belief system, it imbibes knowledge of the world, it imbibes experiences and so on. If we do not use them, then it is not a viable option for communication, because communication refers to conveying these aspects of meaning through a rule based string of sounds. So, what we ultimately have is an output that is rule based. Of course, there are grammatical rules, but what it conveys is of course also very important, and what it conveys is those understandings, those knowledge system, belief, experiences and so on. Hence, modularity aspect has been very severely criticized. As a result of the later findings from the different disciplines is now the understanding about language is that language is part of the general cognitive faculty of the human brain. Human brain is capable of carrying out various kinds of actions like attention, like executive control, like many other things like that. Similarly, language is just another general purpose cognitive mechanism, and like any mechanism, it also depends on cooperation across various different kinds of different types of mental faculty. It cannot be a modular, it cannot be insulated from other mental faculties. So, language functions as a result are not dissociated from other mental functions. Neuroscience, psycholinguistics, cognitive psychology and this kind of disciplines have given us enough data, enough empirical evidence to take this as a starting point, that language functions are actually in a very strong relationship with many other mental faculties. In fact, this is what we will be exploring in this course through various subdomains. And brain areas responding to executive functions have been found to be associated with language related tasks as well. So, formally this is just one example of how language function, language use is dependent on other mental functions. Similarly, findings from visual world studies have strongly put forward evidence that language and attentional mechanisms are intrinsically related. We will build up on these later on in the area of attention and executive control. Similarly, research on theory of mind and its use in atypical children is something we will explore in the language learning, and how theory of mind, the development of theory of mind in atypical children is also has something to do with the language use and language exposure and so on. So, what do all these things mean? It means that language cannot and does not function in a vacuum. We have till now the studies that we have focused on basically bring us this primary understanding that language is not working in isolation. It works with in relation to various other kinds of mental mechanisms. So, understanding any facet of language, either processing or learning, language is not again an unitary thing, it is not a monolith, it has many facets. So, learning language, teaching language, processing language, all these are taken into account a plethora of non-linguistic factors which have nothing to do with linguistics, which have nothing to do with language per se, but it has to do with everything human. Then we can move on to the understanding of mind. We have already talked about cognition and in terms of brain as in terms of thought. So, we will talk about the faculties of mind. So, mind again is not unitary. Mind is kind of understood always to be composed of various functions. So, from the very beginning of the study of mind, it has been understood to be having separate domains of understanding. So, these are called the faculties of mind. So, for example, to start with, reason, thought, morality, emotion, willing, volition, language, etc. are part of mind. And reality, as we have seen already, this is something we have already covered, but we just talk briefly about it. Reality and its relation to the mind, again we talk about most part of knowledge. Remember, we talked about knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge refers to the reality, the truth as it is in the world. So, reality also refers to the reality of the world, the idea of the world. Now, here is where the debate is, and does the world come in a structured form or it does come in a unstructured form. If it is in a structured form already, that means it already exists without any tempering by the human mind. It is independent of the human mind and its manipulations. But on the other side, the idea is that reality is really unstructured. It is just a mass that gains structure through the human beings interference. The cognitive processes of the human mind create what reality is for us. It is not a pre-given thing that is already out there. So, mind and body relationship we have already seen in terms of Descartes. So, there is mind is transcendent, it is independent of the body and it is abstract and goes beyond the body. On the other hand, mind, the understanding of embodied cognition talks about mind that is based on the body. So, we have already seen this before. So, as a result of which the current status of language studies in terms of based on the empirical evidence that we already have is that language is a higher order mental function which works in tandem with other mental faculties. So, along with that, language's relation with context also starts to get inspected. So, not only in the inside, not only in terms of the brain and mind, language works in relationship with other mental faculties, but it also interacts outside the human brain. So, there are two different worlds that are interacting, the world inside of us and the world outside. So, inside there is a lot of cooperation between language faculty and the other mental faculties, and the same brain also interacts with the world, the felt experiences, the human experiences and the context and the user and so on and so forth, and that all that information is also incorporated in the language structure and use and understanding and communication. So, this is ultimately what language is all about, and it is very difficult to separate language from all these aspects, and that is exactly how we will look at language in this course. So, but that does not mean that the abstract rule based representation of language in the human brain is negated in any way. So, we can safely say, even though the debate is still on, that is the last word is not yet out. So, debate between formal language and everyday language is far from over, but we can agree and disagree at the same time. We can agree that there is a rule based which is beyond of course, beyond debate, that there is a set of rules that operate at a very higher level, at an abstract level, that creates all the grammatical sentences in a language, and that is how language remains understandable, but at the same time language is also used by humans in real context. So, in this course we will I hope after this brief introduction over 3 parts, we have seen both sides of the story. However, in this course we will be looking at language, human language as it is used in the real context, and how it really and what are the most interesting aspects of it. So, for doing that, we will start with our point of departure will be meaning construction and its dynamics. So, intensive study of cognition that lies behind language used and that also goes beyond it. It is when we speak, when we use language, when we process language in terms of either speaking or understanding, there is a lot that is going on behind the scene, which is basically which is called the backstage cognition, and it includes a plethora of mental activities, and that is what is at the that is what also leads to meaning construction, meaning the dynamics of meaning generation, meaning construction and conceptualization. All these are things that we will look at. So, language not only helps creating this, but also reflects it. A language activity draws unconsciously, as I just said, on a vast amount of cognitive resource, like referring to different models, set up multiple connections, coordinate large amount of information, engage in creative mapping and transfer and elaboration, and so on and so forth. So, this is basically what is referred to as backstage cognition in literature, and all that information as we speak is ultimately it is optimized in language structure. So, a lot of information is given out dependent on these kind of mappings like viewpoints, reference, figure ground mapping, and then trajectory, landmark and trajectory mapping, and metaphors and metonymy, and so on and so forth, ultimately gives rise to the brevity that we see in language. We can say a lot with very few words, with it is a very cleverly created structure. That is not something that we create all the time. Of course, that also happens. Individual creativity is also visible sometimes, but as every language has its own way of making those connections across domains and making various kinds of projections, various kinds of backstage cognition that reflects through language is what we are more interested in. So, this is these are some of the things that through which we will look at this phenomena of language interacting with other mental faculty. So, framing, prototype structure, pragmatic functions, so on and so forth. To do this, there is a new relatively new field of linguistics, which is called the cognitive linguistics, and this is the domain that we will start our journey with. This is a relatively new field. It came into existence after the cognitive revolution, and it owes its origin to many names like George Lakoff and others. So, this discipline, this particular standpoint takes the theoretical standpoint that syntactic validity of utterances cannot be judged without referring to non-linguistic concepts. A sentence is can be judged in terms of its meaning, in terms of what it conveys. That is what he says. So, description of linguistic structures needs to take into account aspects of general cognition, like how meaning is construed. The same sentence can mean different things in different contexts. So, it's very humid today. Man can mean different things in different contexts, whether it is in India or it is in a different country, where generally humidity is not the general feature. of course, the meaning is different. It can even have some speech act related to it. So, meaning cannot be discounted like Chomsky it is done in Chomskyan paradigm. So, linguistics basically the understanding of grammar, the understanding of language structure is based on the conceptualization and human experience. That is the starting point of cognitive linguistics. So, meaning is said to reside in conceptualization. So, conceptualization is a mental process, that is not linguistic in nature, that is a primary mental function to which language is related, and meaning is basically created out of that process. So, grammar is not seen as autonomous, grammar cannot be seen as an autonomous entity, and it takes meaning as the central issue in human language study. And that is how it offers, this domain offers an unified account of meaning in language while accounting for various social and cultural phenomena. So, as a result of which it does not believe, this discipline does not believe, this subdiscipline of linguistics does not believe that reality is already structured. It is it depends a lot on the language, it depends on the various other non-linguistic factors. So, language the reality is unstructured. So, however, it is not entirely subjective. There are universals as well, and which arises from the fact that we have similar bodies and brains, and that we inhabit similar kinds of environments, and that we communicate with each other. So, there are of course a lot of universality to it. However, this discipline also takes into account the other side of the story, the interaction between different kinds of contexts. So, this is seriously dependent on the embodied understanding of language. So, this is the linguistics aspect, how linguistics have been structured through centuries, through a couple of centuries, and how over a period of time theoretical standpoints have changed, and where we are today in terms of cognitive linguistics. So, we will start the first the module 2, first lecture of module 2 with cognitive linguistics. And however, it is also important to look at the psychological side of it. So, how that the role of cognitive psychology and cognitive psychology together on understanding language has also been extremely important, but we will discuss it during the course, not in the introduction. It will be discussed more in detail later. Here are some references that are useful to understand this particular aspect. And so, here we complete the module 1, first module in 3 parts that was designed to give a brief background of the course that we will be eventually looking at through different points of departure. Thank you, and we will move on to the next module.